Yeah, well, Venezuela is a really interesting country because, like most Latin American countries, it rise into modernity with a bunch of strongman figures, a bunch of dictatorships, right? But then it became a really democratic country starting in the mid 50s after the fall of Marcos Pérez Jiménez, was a big dictator. It became a really stable democracy for quite a few years, aided by, of course, its boom of oil, its richness, right? So which made Venezuela a point of interest for many powers, most of all for the United States because it was so close. The US saw Venezuela as a very important ally, a source of cheap oil very close to them. So it became a pretty stable democracy, but with the rise of the left in Latin America, especially after the Cuban Revolution, those ideologies started to come in hardcore, right, into Venezuela. So we had our own version of a leftist movement in the 1960s. Because Venezuela was so stable and had a pretty uh, thriving democracy at that point, that movement didn't go very far. It kind of died in the first 5 or 10 years of it. Um, and that leftist movement was folded into democracy, and we had the rise of important political parties that were left leaning, and they were allowed to operate very freely in the country. But the movement itself was really important in the 1960s. It created chaos. It was certainly violent in its own ways. The democratic government that was there at that point was really harsh on the movement, stamped it down with its own cruelties and extremism. But that dissatisfaction with the movement dying sort of continued its through line, and it eventually inspired movements like the Chavista movement that eventually came to power. And of course, Hugo Chavez came to power in the late 90s and completely changed the life of the country, transformed it with huge popular support. Um, and then as time passed, started to really turn into a more dictatorial, tyrannical regime. And it continued to devolve until what we have now, which, the past few weeks alone, in early August, late July, um, we've had President Maduro basically steal an election that was overwhelmingly um, supporting a change. And we now have people in the streets marching, dying, over 1,000 political prisoners, hundreds of them teenagers. I mean, it's really chaotic and horrible right now. Yeah, Stanislavo is a young idealist from the city. He comes from a privileged background, but he grew up sort of in the oil fields of Venezuela. His parents were doctors, so he knows what the working class looks like, and he grows up with some of these ideals seeping in, right? He decides that he's sick of city activism, of university activism. He's been part of the Communist Party for a little while as a young journalist writer, and he asks his superior to send him to where the real action is going on, which is in the jungles of Venezuela, in the mountains. There he meets Emiliana, who's a young indigenous nurse who is also starting to sort of become involved with the movement. And for a few months, they have this kind of ideal romantic vision of what a country in revolution looks like. They are lucky where they don't have violent confrontations. They have this kind of bubble where they live in, just living the ideals that they believe in. And they fall in love. And then, of course, circumstances change. Stanislavo gets captured, and that changes their life. In this case, he's past that point. He would never kind of turn coat or join the government, but because of his station, because he is knows some of the leadership of the leftist movement, and because he's white, they don't torture him and kill him. They're kind of keeping him as maybe as something to trade, so that the government realizes that Stanislavo is maybe different than, a poor fisherman or a poor farmer that they've captured. One of the things that I was really interested in doing was in just exploring these very intense historical moments and staying with the characters through relatively really short periods of time, and then revisiting them years later in another really intense historical moment. I thought that it allowed me to explore the history of Venezuela in an interesting way, to sort of show that history to people that might not be familiar with it, but to still check in with these characters at very important moments in their own lives. So Stanislavo, of course, and Emiliana in the 1960s, we see their love. We see the way that they fall in love with each other and what that brings. Then we jump to 1998 when Hugo Chavez is about to win the presidency for the first time. And we visit with Emiliana, who's now hasn't seen Stanislavo for many years, has a daughter that Stanislavo doesn't know about, and we see her relationship with her daughter and her grandson. Um, and we see, of course, Chavez winning and the change that that brings to the country. And then we jump to 2002, which there was a coup against Chavez that briefly deposes him. And we check in with Maria and Stanislavo, living completely separate lives, not knowing about each other at all. And Maria's son gets shot in these kind of heightened protest situation that's going on. And Maria needs to fight tooth and nail to save the life of her son. And randomly, by fate, meets her dad. And Stanislava still doesn't know who she is, but she does, because Maria and her mom have talked about Stanislava before. So there's a choice there. Do I reveal myself to my father, who I don't like because he's left us for all our lives? And she decides not to reveal herself. And then we move to when Eloy is older. Now Chavez has been in power for over a decade. The country is in real dire straits. The revolution has sort of failed, but is still holding on to power. And Chavez is dying of cancer. So the country is on the verge of another huge change. And here we see Eloy, Stanislavo, and Emiliana's grandson fallen into this sort of life of crime that he didn't want to, through his friend Willie. And we meet him when he's kidnapping these boys and he's about to be sent to prison. And then we have this family, by fate, throughout all these years, coming back together in unexpected circumstances. And it's an opportunity for them to mend old wounds, to reconnect, and to sort of bring hope to their lives again. Because you have so many threads, and you have to bring them together in a way that is satisfying, not only for yourself as a writer, what you imagine the reader, but also for the characters. I just felt this need for these characters to truly feel like they had reconnected, they had come together.